No. Hey, everybody. I am Emily Moyer from OffPlanet Media, and Michael Wann from the Susquehanna Alchemy is with me. And we are beginning a new little adventure today that we are not clear yet where it's going to go. Michael and I have gotten to know each other in the last several weeks. We did not know each other until this new condition that we're sort of in right now. But it's been one of these experiences where I'm super happy he kind of showed up in my reality at the time he did. And we have some things that we want to explore. And rather than doing what we normally do in the alternative media and dictating sort of what our show will be about or whatnot, we're going to do a series of shows that are sort of based around an experience Michael is having right now, which I will let him tell you in just a moment. That's going to be sort of based around that, but also start to explore creating separate realms for ourselves to visit and reside in during these unusual times and maybe for the foreseeable future going forward. And so we're going to kind of let it take a life on take on a life of its own. And so things will become more developed as we go along. So we're starting out on this adventure now. Michael Wann, welcome. I'm happy to be doing this with you.
Emily, I am so happy to be here, and thank you for setting up like the infrastructure for like us having this conversation because if it was left to me, that wouldn't happen. That's not really my strength. So it's cool when two different people when like their skill sets like mesh really well. Like that's always a nice thing to see. And I think right now, I mean, that's kind of what my own personal lens is like how I'm looking at reality, like, or, specifically my own reality, like where are things lining up and where are things lining up effortlessly? And I would say this is definitely one of these like effortlessly lined up things because prior to what I like to call the worldwide initiation, I didn't know who you were, you didn't know who I was. And like, this just kind of, it fell as naturally as raindrops.
Absolutely. And in that same vein, a very unusual experience fell like a raindrop right into your lap. And it sort of has served for some of the inspiration for what we're going to do here. So for the people who haven't been following on your channel, why don't you let people know what's been going on with you for the last couple of weeks?
All right. And so, I mean, really, the journey began maybe about like 5 or 6 years ago for me, but I'm gonna and maybe like throughout the unfolding of what we're doing here, I can get to some more of those details because I mean, ultimately, I'm a storyteller, and I got like all these really cool stories, which I think are cool. I don't know.
They're cool. They're cool.
But so like 5 years ago is really when I was on like a certain trajectory of life, and then like everything in my life kind of like this fell apart, if you will, just, the normal things that happen when families break up, when divorces happen. And when that began, and I really got like a clean slate, like it's not necessarily an easy thing to do, but at that point, I really became more so than I had ever been before, like consciously aware of like watching my life unfold and really looking at, where things mesh up perfectly, synchronicities, like all of these sort of things. So I've been kind of like on that journey for 5 years. And maybe a handful of years ago, I started doing this research project known as the Susquehanna Mystery. And that was filled with all of these different sort of like, it was just getting like more from what I was seeing. And I don't think I'm unique. I just think what I'm unique is like I'm good at seeing it. And that's one of the reasons I want to tell the story is like almost an inspiration for people like, oh, wait, let me look at my life from a different lens, like, and begin to see like, this is kind of like how our reality works in terms of how things fall together in effortless ways. And particularly at this time, this is what I think is like maybe one of the best compasses we can use to kind of navigate this false dream which is being put upon us. But back to our story. So for people who have been following along, like on Instagram, I started I started following or telling the story of this new place I moved into in December of last year. So what was that? I don't even know. It feels like 10 years ago, but it was probably like 5 months ago. And it was just like everything in this house and like my partnership, it was like so perfect, and like how it all lined up, and like peaking even more so than what the previous 5 years had been. And then maybe about 3 weeks ago, bam, like everything kind of like there was this shift. There was a shift. Like everything is like moving me like perfectly in this sort of environment. And then all of a sudden, I had to get out. And I don't want to get into like, the details of that, but like instantaneously, like, everything which was so perfect suddenly became so internally, like all of the pressures which you could imagine, which is being placed upon like us collectively, like I was feeling that like internally, but through my own life, there were events and stuff that would bring it about. So I'm like lying in bed. I'm lying in bed and I'm feeling all this pressure, and I'm like, and one of the things I say to myself, and particularly in situations, and is like, when one door shuts, a window opens. That
Mhm.
just, it makes sense to me. It's a good place for me to put my mind if I'm ever in a situation where I want to focus where I'm thinking. So as that's happening, or like as I'm kind of going through that process, my phone rings. And I usually don't answer my phone, to be quite honest. And oh no, I don't like the phone. But I answer it, and someone who like ties into directly, like in this very, very instrumental way, like, the beginning of my journey, which I said 5 years ago, is that person. And this person, they've got like a important job. And what I mean by important is that there's like responsibility, and they run this one organization. They're like, listen, I got a situation, and maybe you can help me out with it. I'm like, all right. And they say that their organization, they purchased a vacant church. They purchased a church and the property it's on, and they have plans for the property. But in the meantime, they've got this 15,000 square foot church. And since it's been vacant, they've been dealing with like break-ins and stuff like that. And when the people left, or the previous organization that was in here left, they just like left everything in here, like all the desks, all like there was a school in the basement and so forth. And so they're like, what I need is for someone to live in the church. And they have to be there every night because, we want to have it as a deterrent for people to come in. We want someone on the premises. And because of our liability, insurance, like no one else is allowed into this property unless it's your blood relatives, because you're going to be staying there. And I want you to get like the building ready for auction. And so what they're going to auction off is like all of like the hundreds of chairs and desks and all the things that would be in the building this size. They kind of like throw out the trash, organize what's there, and get it ready for this auction. So I thought about it for a little bit, and I very much have a perspective of like how I view like both the outer reality, and then specifically the significance of what's going on right now, and then maybe like a larger kind of perspective as to like what's unfolding on earth at this time, and then like how that ties into my whole life. So like everything's lining up, and I'm literally saying to myself, like, as a door shuts, a window opens. And this call from this person who's like directly related to when all of this kind of began has this solution for me. And the solution's a little bit uncomfortable, right? Being alone in a church for 60 days. That's how long the commitment is for. And I was like, I'm going to step into it. And I'm probably about day 12 into it. I mean, obviously I can leave during the day, but I'm approaching this experience with man, I don't know, like 10 years ago or so ago, like I went down to Peru to one of those ayahuasca retreats. And, that's not really a big part of my life, going to retreats. So, within my own life story, like this was a big deal. And I prepared for that internally and like physically very, very seriously. And I'm like, with the expectation that, I was going to go into it on one side and come out the other side, different, how, I don't know. And that's how I see this experience, and that's how I'm approaching it. And it is turning out, I'm only day 12 into it, and it's on a certain level, like it's been the most, so far, one of the most profound and amazing experiences which I've had, in my own life, or at least what I remember or am aware of.
Yeah, it's so I'm having lots of thoughts as you're sitting there, and I'm looking at this. I have a question. Are you still working at your day job, or you're not working at your day job anymore?
No, I took off from the day job.
Gotcha. Okay.
Well, and what's nice is like, just as this is happening, I mean, I'm getting a little bit of money to do the work here, but then I also do different services for people, and I've done this for like years, but like all of a sudden, like that is stepped up.
Hmm.
and and where there was one hole before, whereas like I wasn't going to do the day job, like this is filled that hole like instantaneously. So that's another example of watching, like when you really not so much surrender to the narrative which is being forced upon us, but surrender to the actual experience of what is right in front of you. Like, there
Yeah.
is more magic I'm seeing now than ever before.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting. I'm sort of going through some of the same type of thing. Like I had been at a place where I had quit a full-time job last year in order to finish some schoolwork, and for a certification for something, and to also work on sort of developing what I'm doing with my nutritional consultations a little bit and whatnot. And then I had gotten to a place where, okay, some of that was in place, but my time wasn't quite full enough yet to, so maybe I was going to go back to work in a restaurant for a day or two a week, which wasn't really something I was wanting to do, but reality calls and whatever. But when this happened, obviously that sort of ended that. There's no work in the restaurant industry. I mean, a lot of people have been laid off. There's very few people working. So what it did instead was like, okay, that's out as an option. So now all there is to do is to get creative and put all of my effort into working for myself and to doing further things with my media presence, and then starting to reimagine ways that I can use my services, the things I offer with my services, to meet people where they're at during this time where they're being told to focus on being fearful about health. Since the focus is obviously supposed to be on health right now, if people will take that same impetus but use it towards doing something positive for their health, it will help them kind of make really good use of this time and counter all of that, like, fear and the idea that someone else has to do something to help you with your health rather than you do it, right? And so for me, it's been totally blossoming the last, since this all happened. Like my sessions I'm getting much, much busier. My media stuff has really started to become interesting and changing. I'm branching out and talking to people from different communities that, like yesterday, I got to interview this guy who I've been following for a bit on Facebook and Instagram, who is from definitely outside of the alternative media, conspiratorial, whatever sort of metaphysical environment. He's from really like the diet, carnivore, skin health kind of, part of the alternative media. And I know that nobody who watches our shows has probably ever seen or heard this guy, but I totally love him. He just it kind of came, like I found his work, a little bit differently than I found you. Steve introduced us, but I started following him. I'm like, dude, I love this guy. Like, there's something about him. Like, I feel like I have a lot in common with him. I don't know anything about him, but I already started telling myself a story in my head about what his past had been. And so I reached out to him, and we did an interview yesterday, and everything that I thought was true about him was true. And we just had this amazing vibe of energy for an hour and a half. And probably if we weren't in this situation, either I wouldn't have reached out to him, or it would have been significantly longer before I did. And so now he's shown up in my reality, and I've shown up in his, and that opens up other, little windows, kind of what you're talking about, right? So certain doors have shut, right? Like, I'm not going back to work in a restaurant. which in some ways I'm really happy about. I enjoy working in restaurants, but there's parts of it that are just a bunch of cockamamie bullshit. And so that door just closed, and now it's like windows are opening and opportunities are arising. And this is really, I think, I can't imagine a better time than right now for lifestyle design, right? For like, because there is no exterior distractions. We can't go into anyone else's, like we can't do the things we normally do. So whatever we want to have happen, we have to do it with our imagination in our own hands, you know, pretty much, right? Like people are building things, people are coming up with ideas, people are launching new sort of businesses or ideas or ways to entertain themselves and each other. And it's really like time for sort of like a master lesson in learning to design your own life regardless of what's going on out there. And one of the things that came up for me during the last couple of weeks, I had an expansive experience, let's put it that way, of the psychedelic nature. And I'm looking at your church there, right? And part of my experience was looking at all the visuals that you often get during a mushroom experience, but they were being projected in my own mind off of the angles of like a mid-century modern kind of house. And I started to understand the purpose of that architecture. I have a cousin who is one of the more famous mid-century modern architects, and I had this really cool interaction with him, you know, like psychic interaction while I was in the psychedelic space. And he explained to me that the mid-century modern architecture, at least in his mind, was all about creating sort of blank canvas spaces that had certain angles for you to project the contents of your mind onto and let that become the art that fills your space, right? And so a lot of people who don't like the sort of minimalist or the design of mid-century modern architecture, part of it is because they're not, you know, either they don't have enough interesting content in their own minds to fill those, you know, sort of blank big spaces, right? Or what comes out isn't something that they want to look at, right? So it's really a space for you to explore your own thoughts in your own mind without having anything imposed on you. It just sets up the geometry or the structure for, you know, the projection, right? And it was pretty cool. And as I'm sitting there looking at your church, it is kind of a mid-century modern kind of space, right? It's not got a lot of ornate things going on. It's got sharp angles and a lot of blank white wall. And where there isn't wall, it's just really wood, right? And there's something very psychedelic about churches anyway. Like even if you look at old ones, right? So the spaces are built based on like where things are at in people's minds or culturally or socially at the time. So the older churches, sometimes they're like, you know, more ornate or have different shapes and whatever. And that's obviously a more mid-century modern kind. But I think one of the things that like all these churches and chapels, like whenever they were, however far back they were, when you first build them, they're empty. And then they started to decorate them with the contents of what their mind saw on the blank walls, right? Whereas in the mid-century modern kind of architecture or things that were built in that time, they decided just to leave it blank. Now, I don't know if they had this clear sight about the emptying of the contents of your own mind onto the backdrop or not, but that's essentially what was happening for that period. And then later we start to get these churches that we have now that are like, just look like shop, like, you know, they're like big, huge, you know, arenas or whatever that have no space for that. It's just cold, you know, there's nothing artistic about it for anyone else's artistic idea or for you to sort of look at the contents of your own mind. And if you think about it, isn't that before, you know, isn't that what a church, if there really is something to this idea of having a place to go to have a spiritual connection with God or wherever it is that you think that you come from or whatever, isn't that a place to go? Shouldn't that be a place to go and explore the contents of your own mind, right? Not so much what somebody else is telling you, right? And the older religions, you know, they were happy to fill that in with all of that stained glass and the painting and whatever. And so at a certain point, you know, certain people's ideas became imposed on what other people saw when they projected the thoughts of their own mind onto that space. But you're in a space where that isn't happening. So, right, there isn't much there. Like I'm not getting any particular, there's one flag back there I see with a cross on it, but, you know, kind of thing. But other than that, it's just wood and white paint and a few metal lights and things hanging, and really some nice angles, you know, some nice angles for you to project your thoughts you know, and the content of your mind off of. And I love the wood. It's like, you know, I love the different sort of tones and textures of nature. So like, you know, the consideration of the organic is there, you know, with whatever is in your mind, which will, you know, is a combination of everything organic and some of the technological overlay based on information you've taken in. But I'm sitting there, I'm like, dude, you get to like, you know, project everything onto this sort of great, like, you know, angled structure above you. You know what I mean? For the next 48 days still. I'm kind of jealous.
I mean, first of all, we share an appreciation of architecture, and
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree with you um, about understanding like the physical space. And there's so many ways to even look at that. Like, I mean, the classic architecture, like, you know, it's all golden ratio. And if you think about like
Yep.
living in a space of something like that, and then what that does to you, like being inside of it, and you know, if you want to follow the Tataria story, you know, if there's anything
Yes.
real to that, like what I love about that, whether it's factual or not, and I like to, I hold a position like, yeah, I'm going to hold that's factual, but the architecture itself was functional. And
Yep.
that is like what I think is like the real truth of architecture,
Yep.
of how it can be functional in a harmonious way with the environment, you know, and whereas the golden ratio might be just a clue to that. But there was one, what I wanted to say, which has been really interesting since I've been here, because I've got like 40 from the peak up there, maybe about 40 feet
Mm-hmm.
from peak to floor. And one of the things I've always done in my meditative practices, like this is where I like to do a lot of like that sort of work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I come here, and I also want to say this, like I wasn't raised in a religious background, and my parents were of two different faiths, and so I don't come with any sort of like emotional baggage or history
Mm-hmm.
tied to, like, you know, a church or Christianity. So I'm stepping in here with a very, very kind of neutral statement, or neutral inner posture, but definitely a recognition, like, you know, I know the churches, I know what goes on here, and, you know, and like, you know, what this is used for. So two things that I've noticed, like one is more so just like in my meditative practices and like being in a architectural space which has a 40-foot ceiling. So one of the things which I do, you know, for whatever reason when I meditate, is I like to bring my awareness and I hold it above my head.
Mm-hmm.
And usually if I'm doing that, particularly if I'm inside, which is the majority of times, if I'm going to go and meditate, like it's always preferred outside, but you know, the majority of time I'm inside, it's kind of limited to the space I'm in. So maybe I'm in a house which has like high ceilings, 12-foot ceilings, but like it's rare that I find myself in a place like this. And where I would hold my consciousness, you know, would normally be, I don't know, like, let's say like a foot or 18 inches above like my physical body. And that being lit often because of like what I'm accustomed to of being in a space. But now I'm just like kind of letting it float up
Mm-hmm.
where, you know, again, like what feels like, you know, trying to interpret, you know, what's happening inside to like a three-dimensional space, but it feels like I'm like 20 feet above my head.
Mm-hmm.
And that in itself has completely changed. Like I've meditated enough in a certain posture that I know what the internal feeling is like. And, you know, metaphorical or literal, like there is a real expansion that happened, like just as I like expand where I'm holding my awareness
Yep.
relative to my body.
Yep.
So there was that, and then and then this other thing, and then I want to hear your reflection back. So the other thing which is interesting about this whole thing. So what's cool about this church is it's in the middle of a neighborhood which might be like, you know, built in the 40s and 50s. Really charming neighborhood. Like I love the neighborhood it's in. And it's on a pretty big parcel of land, like 4 or 5 acres, and it's up on a hill. And so it's like kind of like it was the church that was built for the people who lived in this neighborhood when the neighborhood was created in the 50s. And so I'm like up and elevated from like all of these, you know, a relatively, you know, dense population of people, but I'm totally separate from them. And so I'm in here, and I really feel in the most in a like a visceral way that I'm in a a literal protective bubble.
Mhm.
And, I don't know if that's just because like, like for whatever reason, like being in a church or what the land the church was built on, because that's also a part of like, what history does. But for whatever reason, I feel it in a way I have not felt before. And let me tell you what I mean. Like I would say everyone, and if they haven't recognized this about themselves, I'm going to say maybe you're not being honest with yourself, but, being in front of the computer, being on the internet creates what I consider compulsive, unhealthy activities. You go and you're like, I'm going to go and just do this. And next thing you know, it's like, how did I just spend 20 minutes on YouTube watching this thing? And like, how did I go down this rabbit hole? And all of this sort of stuff. Like the entire internet has been designed from the very, very bottom of the OSI stack to the top of it to suck you in. It's the web, it's the net. And, there's a truth to that. And I've always been aware that, yes, there's stuff I want to use it for. And yes, you can justify in your mind, but I know that this has an effect on me in many ways, which is strong.
Mhm.
Since I've been in this church, all of that, and I've been aware of that for like 10 years, 15 years, I've been noticing that it all disappeared. I can go on the internet and just do the work I need to do. And when I'm done, like I'm just focused in a way I've never been before. And it's not as if like, I'm applying willpower. It's not like I'm stopping an urge. It's like the urge isn't there.
Mhm.
And I don't believe the urge has ever been like my own natural urge. I've always thought it was part of like what the way that, whether it's the coding of a website, or whether it's with
Mhm.
what or the electromagnetic field that comes through, or the carrier waves, like I never thought it was completely me that was pulling on, and I'm not being affected by that here. And then and let me say one more thing. I've
Yeah.
had like what I thought would be one of the first nights I was here, like this is a big space, and like the alarm went off, like, and it said lost contact with back door and basement. And it's like 2 a.m, and the basement is like dark and like filled with rooms, and I'm like, I got to go down and check it out. And I'm not normally one who gets like, nervous a lot, but like, something like that is like, if you're going to go and walk down in the basement in a creepy
Mhm.
church in the middle of the night when there might be someone breaking in, like, you're going to feel a little bit of butterflies. And I did not feel for a second. Like I'm watching this, I'm like, I don't feel anything. Like, like whatever's going to happen is going to happen, but I don't feel anything. And so that's what I'm accrediting to being in this space, whatever it is like there's this visceral within my body, which I'm seeing, like I'm relating to things which would be maybe like anxiety filled or influential on me in the past, which they've lost their capability. Like I feel like a real person.
Yeah. All right, let me see so there's a couple of things that came up. So the things I want to hit at were your observation about being 20 feet above yourself, right?
All
That,
right.
your observation about what the internet has done to us and to you. And then this idea of the protected space in the church. And hopefully I can remember my points on each of those.
All
Okay.
right. I think I can remember them, so I'll get you back to it.
All right. Okay. So when you started saying the thing about the, projecting your consciousness up higher and higher because you have the space to do so, like I interviewed not that long ago this guy, Dr. Jacob Lieberman, and he's he teaches people to see to get rid of their glasses. And he does that by teaching them to start to use the space up and behind their head to see from, right? To basically be seeing from sort of their consciousness or some area above and behind them, as opposed to with their eyes. He's also an expert in light color therapy and all this kind of stuff, and getting people to resolve their emotions by exposing them to certain colors and, and whatnot. He's a very interesting guy. But so I was thinking about that, right? That really is where our awareness actually lies. And we keep trying, it's been shoved down into the space where we think that our head, our brain is where our awareness, our consciousness, our higher stuff resides. And that's actually like a really limited space. It's kind of like a room with, we all love a room with the vaulted ceiling, right? It just makes you, there's a lot more there. So that was my first thought. Then my second thought was, because we've had a conversation before about I'm a big fan of tennis for obviously the athletic portion, but really more for a lot of the metaphorical or symbolic or esoteric aspects that come up with it. And one of the things I hear all of the time, there's a lot of guys who are great servers, right? Who have a really hard serve. Like I think still to this day, Andy Roddick served the highest clocked serve in men's tennis, I think at 155. There may have
155?
155 miles an
Holy
hour.
crackers.
Yeah, and I think there may be one guy who's gotten one harder, but I'm pretty sure that that's and he did it a couple times, and he regularly was up there in the high 140s and whatnot. And this was, he's retired several years now, but this was in the early 2000s he was doing this. So there's a lot of guys who can hit a lot of aces that can hit hard, but the person that I hear most people say, most of the other players say that the serve that they would like to have is John Isner. And John Isner is almost 7 feet tall. He's about 6'11" and a half. And when he serves, it just comes in at a different trajectory. It's like he's seeing the tennis court from up in the trees as opposed to ground level, right? And so he's able to sort of find and see angles that you just can't find and see from. Andy Roddick was not short. He's like 6'2" or 6'3", but having that extra space, right? That extra 20 inches or 20 feet, right? It just gives you a completely different view on reality from which to impose your game. And I don't mean impose your game in a negative way, right? But how you're going to deal with the landscape that is your reality. So I thought about that. And then I started to think about, as you were talking, I started to think about, we all forget for a second about there's things like satellites and whatever from look way up high. But since the beginning of knowledge, and especially esoteric knowledge, the symbolism of the owl, right, has been huge. And what is it about wise old owl? Well, part of it is the vantage point that they're seeing things from. They're close enough to still feel what's going on the ground, but to have this trajectory where they can look at the exact same things and see something completely different than what we see at ground level, even for a tall person. And I think that may be what some of the obsession with owls or this, birds on a wire or something like that, right? We've seen this in art and television shows and movies and everything we've looked at. And a lot of esoteric kind of doctrine has reference to these kinds of things. And I was wondering if that's why. That space that is not quite in the sky, but not at ground level either. So that was my first thought.
I want to talk or respond specifically to the second point which you made. I mean, I love the tennis analogy, but that's exactly kind of like in the same way which you're describing your area of expertise, particularly with understanding the physical body and understanding how the workings of the physical body. My area of real interest is the inner world, the emotional world, the imaginatory world. That's where I'm particularly, I'm interested in and I experiment and I study. And so a lot of what I'm at least feeding my mind with right now is, and it's stuff I've been looking at for many, many years, but this idea of, being so identified with our personality selves, what we've learned, literally we learned, and this is just how human beings work, is, the different sort of techniques and ways which we interact with life. And we learn that as children, and then they continue to grow and grow. And then we get these personalities and we think we're these personalities. And that's where a lot of this internal emotional turmoil exists. And the solution is never, it's never at the level of the problem. And so you can't think your way out. It's helpful to know your story. It's helpful because it allows you to release your story. But realistically, it doesn't matter what the story is. It's just understanding that. But then once that occurs, you don't want to stay in that mental sort of world to try to think out why I am this way, as much as it is to transcend.
Yeah.
And when I hold my awareness above my head, like that's literally what like in the logical mind, like this is the reason why I'm doing it, is because I'm stepping out, and it's exactly how you described it. I'm stepping out of like this limited model of what we're told of like our inner experience or our mental experience is happening in these three layers of the brain, like our brain and the limbic, and then the neocortex. I'm like, no, there's something greater. And so I used to hold my attention so I could see the world. That's literally what I do, is I try to go and hold an awareness of like, I'm viewing the world there, because when I'm viewing the world there, I'm not associated or identified with like, my story.
Yeah.
And to then go up one level higher, like it felt like even more like tangible. And so to hear like, I'm thinking like I'm playing with this myself. When you're like, oh yeah, there's this guy, Dr. Was it Leibowitz? And
Dr. Lieberman, Joseph Lieberman. Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, he says, you go up there and you look, and I'm like, friggin' Lieberman. But exactly. And I'm like, I kind of backed into that myself. So obviously, and part of what I think, what this opportunity, this worldwide initiation is offering, is not just like to rewrite or design your life. That's definitely part of it, but it's an awareness that what we have always been culturally indoctrinated with, were what life should be like. This is what it means to be a human. You react this way, and you do this type of exercise, or you do this, whatever. It's like, no, that's all wrong. It's close, it's inverted to like kind of what it should be, but it's not what it should be. And then these new ways, like literally the existence of life is changing right now. And how we change is by changing the way we are. And so for me, I focus on the inner world, and I focus on consciousness, but it's just as true as the physical body. It's just as true in like all of the different parts of being human, and they're all like kind of linked. Like there's no difference between the body and the mind, and all of the different things. So I find that I find it really, really cool when listening to you talk.
Yeah. All right. So me too. Like the whole thing, like I guess what I like to do is just like, I take a situation that everyone else can just say, okay, this is the situation. And I hop up and view it from all of these different sort of perspectives. Like my mind is naturally good at doing that, just to sort of like see it from a funny position, and then try and come up with a clever enough story to tell it, to get people to at least consider it. Right. So, okay. So that was first. And then the second thing was what your thoughts about what this internet and our relationship with it was doing to our mind. So one of the things that like, we have like some overt, what you said about algorithms, right? We have some overt examples of like, there was this couple, John and Bonnie Mitchell, several years back, that Randy did an interview with them, and they were talking about mnemonic circles and sigil magic in media, but also in the fact that some of these streaming sites like Hulu, right, were using particular algorithms that created the same, like mnemonics, created like a distortion in your perception of what's, kind of thing. It's using algorithms and flicker patterns to, sort of change the way you receive the information. And they even, pretty much, it was acknowledged in the first ads for Hulu with, Alec Baldwin with that octopus alien thing around him, right? Showing exactly what it was, right? So we're very aware of that. Then there's also like, I don't know if you ever, it's probably not quite in your genre of things you research, but for people who went really far down the mind control rabbit hole, there was this website, I don't know if it's still around, called Data Asylum, right? That basically initiated you into the way that targeting of individuals and electronic harassment and gang stalking and things like that work. So in some ways, you had, like, it was the best description of what it was. Like, it was really gave you a complete understanding of what it was. But by going there and reading about this, it turned it basically into like a disease of awareness, where you then began experiencing it because you were aware of it, right? So that one. And then just a few weeks ago, when you recorded the OffPlanet Radio show with us, you had a moment where you froze, right? Remember, like when you just like you were aware, but you like on a certain level, but you couldn't speak, or you couldn't, function in the way you normally did. And in Westworld, which is that TV show on HBO where there's these hosts or sort of technological or cyborg or clone kind of, like artificial people that start to gain sort of a certain level of conscience and sentience and whatever, right? Like when the humans who run the park are trying to like turn them off, they will say, freeze all motor functions, right? And they'll just go into that froze where they're still sort of there and awake, but everything is kind of stopped, right? At a certain point, one of them developed the ability to continue cogniting while that was happening, almost like what you were. You were there, you were aware, you could hear and see what was going on, but you couldn't do anything, right? You were just kind of freeze all motor functions, right? And if you listen to things like when Elon Musk talks about, well, we're going to be turned into AI anyway, so we may as well do it ourselves with Neuralink. And he'll say, we're already cyborgs anyway, right? And so I think one of the things that our relationship with the internet, with our personal devices, be it the computer and particularly the cell phone, right, and whatnot, has made like a feedback loop or some sort of symbiotic relationship where we are subject to some of the processes that go on inside of the technology, right? You know how your phone freezes up, or sometimes like the web page you want won't open or whatever, right? Like it's almost like we've become part of that system, and that can happen. And I think that was sort of what you experienced. I remember you were kind of mystified by it, and I had a couple of ideas about it, and we never really got into talking too much about it, but that was one of the ideas that I had is almost like, we're all used to the Zoom pages freezing sometimes, right? Or there being a little interruption. And it was almost like that kind of interruption extended to you for a second as well, or instead of just the page, right?
Well, that's a really that's a really interesting way of looking at that. I forgot that happened, and that was and what. No, now these are two examples. Last night I was on a show, and I told this story about how I was at this like years ago. I was at outside of Philadelphia. There's something. There's a park which you pay access to go to, like not a public park. Used to be a DuPont, one of the DuPont family like things, like, and it's beautiful, and it's it's called Longwood Gardens. And I was there one night for like an outside event, like an art event, and there were all of these strobe lights, and it was like timed with music, and it was like really well done. But I froze then. That's the only other time that I've had that physical response. And like one of the reasons I'm so intrigued by always go to Longwood Gardens is it's like, you walk through it, and it's like it's the most eyes wide shut Illuminati playground I've ever seen. And I'm just walking around, and it's huge and it's beautiful. It's done with like the type of money the DuPonts would have. And I'm like looking at, I'm like, one, this is still in use every, whenever this is in use, like the people who want to have access to it, they can, and it's completely circulate and private, that they can do so. But like there was recognizing like that happened to me 5 years ago. I can't think of another time that's happened to me. But then you're right. When I was on that call with you, I don't know, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, I've used the computer plenty of times. I've never frozen like that. And I remember my experience, like inside, I was like, I had a flash in my mind. I don't know if you ever saw, like there was a if you've seen a lot of like the MK Ultra like glitches of celebrities.
Yep.
And Eminem was on like Monday Night Football, and like he just stops. And I was like, oh, this is what it's like when you just totally stop. Like, and it was like for like a split second, like I was totally aware that I did not know, like there was nothing else really going on, but I was affected by something. And I was, and like the idea of like picking up the Zoom freeze, that kind of makes sense because Zoom has I mean, I'd used Zoom prior to the worldwide initiation, but I was surprised to hear of how many people have never heard of Zoom before.
Yeah.
And suddenly Zoom became like, oh yeah, that's the go-to thing, that's what you do. Like, don't Skype, or don't do, I guess maybe Skype, you can't do that many people. I don't know these things, but there is a certain pressure that is being applied from the same system that's crafting this dream to go use Zoom.
Yep, absolutely. Well, and also many times since the worldwide initiation began, Zoom has had to fix, update, change things about their technology. There's been a lot of bugs, right? So as that technology and algorithms behind it are changing, the way it affects those of us who used it, and we've been used to it being a certain experience. So maybe our systems would pick up on a slight switch in that experience, different than somebody who was just starting to use it, right? So like whenever you're used to things being a certain way, even if it's outside of your perception, and then there's a shift, there's something in you that feels that, right? So that, and then also that is certainly is a thing that happens with MKs. You see that a lot. You've seen it happen with Al Roker on the news. You've seen it happen with a lot of athletes. And, sometimes it is like a freeze all motor functions kind of moment. Or if somebody either intentionally or accidentally says a word that is one of the triggers for one of their alters or programs, but doesn't say enough to really get the whole thing to go through, but just to start the switch, and then they get stuck for a second, because a lot of times it's a combination of like a word or two, and then like a flash of something, or a woman in a red dress or something, and if only one of those elements are present, the mind is going to start to go there, but it doesn't receive the rest of the command. So I think there's that kind of possibility. And then
Can I reflect on that for a second?
Yeah.
Because I mean, I don't know if you saw my expression when you were saying that. I want to go and see what was said right before then. I want to see what was said before. I mean, because you and I have talked about this before. Like, we're both project kids.
Yeah.
To varying degrees, and you were so spot on. Like, when you research certain dark elements of like weaponized alchemy. That's what mind control is.
It's for using frequencies. Yeah.
And it's like you will begin like that in itself, like MK Ultra. If you study the techniques, you're now in. Like, so for whatever reason, like, we're all part of it. Wow. Like, I don't know how deep a lot of the stuff goes. And I don't
MK Ultra is
my own personal story.
MK Ultra is a combination of magic and science, right? Which is alchemy, basically, right? That's, large what alchemy is. But yeah, like, we should go back and take a look at that. And then I also wanted to address what you said about going to that festival at the park and the lights and the sound. Think about like raves and things like that, with all of the pounding frequencies, both sound and light, and strobe lights and laser light shows and visuals on the background and whatever. And a lot of what I've seen is, so like, you've seen those classic videos of kids getting MK Ultra programming where they're like sitting there with a helmet on looking at visuals that are crazy, right? A lot of that occurred in a black box or an anechoic chamber, kind of like a float tank kind of scenario, right? So a lot of the buildings, that like underground parties and raves are held in are just big black rooms. So it creates kind of the same projection for kind of like space, right? And then you're just standing there receiving all of this stuff, right? Which at a certain level can be like an amazing kind of experience. But depending on the coherence of the frequencies, right? If they're discordant, or if they're, if they're harmonic or in tune with each other in a particular, I've had some amazing experiences, but I've also had shit where it's like, feels like someone is trying to do something to my mind. And I've been to events, like I went to this one thing that a friend of mine was playing at in Austin that isn't really the kind of music that I'm into. And it was a lot of like extreme, like hardcore and trap kind of music. And I was sitting there watching these kids with their eyes wide open. They were hardly moving, or if they were, it was very rigid ways. And their eyes are wide open. They look like a kid in front of the TV or something just like this. All this sound coming in, all these lights coming at their face. And it's like, shit, this is kind of like a technological lobotomy or something that's going on, right? Like, it's just hitting all that, with the lobotomy, they go into your mind, your brain up here through your eye. Right. So it's that same area where like your third eye is. So it's like technological castration of your own third eye with something imposed on it. And yeah, so there's also some people who just are sensitive and they may have a seizure when they're in some place where there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on. Even on some TV shows and movies now, they warn you about that. So those technologies definitely have the ability to use that, and they took very full advantage of that in mind control programs as well.
Well, totally. But here's the thing, like I've seen plenty of things. I've been to plenty of events where I've not had an experience like that. It's not like
me too. Yeah.
And so that's what was interesting about those two experiences. Like, I know that's not common. Like, you need to have a point of reference if you want to begin to kind of like figure out any sort of mystery. You got to have something to compare it to. And so that's what was so interesting about of these two unique things. Like, why were these different?
If it was, my guess would be, like in the case with us, it was probably a word that was said, or maybe in combination with whatever the algorithm of Zoom, or maybe something like that. And then the thing at the event was just two particular frequencies hitting each other in a way, two or more, in a way that created, some sort of particular vibration or some sort of signal to your brain based on something it's experienced before, or something like that. That does that, and it's truly magical how some of this works, But okay, so those were there was those 2 points, and then the third was this idea that you're feeling protected in this space, even when something quote unquote scary happens, or a thing that should be scary. Mm-hmm. And my thought, there's two things that came up. First of all, like, you didn't just decide to go stay there in the church and leave your things at home. You brought a lot of your stuff there. And you set up and you made this your own space, and you took advantage of all, so you kind of, a lot of things about old buildings or old churches, or a place that isn't normally where one would live, or even if they do, like the basement, people usually ignore that part. You kind of came in and made this space your own, right? And so it's not, like, you kind of declared your territory on a certain level, right, energetically, by doing that. And so I think there's a certain amount of protection in that. And then also, like, I think a lot of the things that we've been told about, like basements being eerie and creepy, are probably to dissuade us from spending time in an area that could be really grounding, right? Because it's in the earth. The basement is in the earth. And so it's got, like, it's different than being out here on top, right? And we know, for as long as media has existed that has made movies about basements being scary, we've been involved in this ongoing mission to unground us, right? And so, like, actually a basement, really, if you thought about it logically, like, and we know this because that's where you put fallout shelters and things like that, it's actually a place of security, right? And so you went down there and you felt nothing because it's fine, you're grounded, you felt good, it's okay, you know what I mean? And so it's interesting that we have this collective idea, as a culture, or maybe even as a species, that a place that, and I also have a lot of thoughts and feelings that we have a deeper relationship with the inside of the earth than we've been told about, right? So that should be a place where there's like a feeling of almost comfort or resonance, or where some of our awarenesses that have been lost come back to us, but we've been dissuaded from being there, or told that that's a place where you go to do naughty things, like a man cave where you watch porn and watch sports or whatever, or, like, bad things go on in the basement. And they've debased that idea of, like, the comfort of, like, inside the earth or on the ground being, being safe.
Well, it's interesting. So, well, the thing which does make this place different is, like, I've had my stuff in my other places before too, yet internet still had a pull on me, which it doesn't have here. There's something unique about here. But as it relates to the basement, and so I'm not living in the basement, I'm living on the upstairs floor, but where I'm doing most of, like, the work here that I'm doing it in the basement. They're like, 15 or 20 different classrooms, which are just filled with stuff which needs to be organized and moved out.
Wow, that's a big basement.
It's a huge building,
Yeah.
It's like, the basement was where there was a school underneath, like, it was set up to have a school. Like, so there was a church and a school, maybe for like Sunday school, I don't know, but there's a lot of space. But the way which I approach, understanding reality, is looking at like your actual actions in life is, very metaphorical, the same way you would almost interpret a dream, if you will. And so literally going into the basement of like whatever a church represents and organizing it and cleaning out the trash and like getting rid of the stuff that just doesn't belong anymore, like on the foundational level. Like, that's always my most interested, where I'm most interested
like
is like
cleaning out the root chakra.
totally.
Yeah.
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 And like in this case, for me at least, because like, my particular hot button is the inner world, the emotional world, the psychological world, is like, literally going and like cleaning out that, like, the stuff which is like repressed, the stuff which is outside of like conscious recall, all of this sort of things, and just like, symbolically organizing it in this very kind of like extraordinary experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. All right. So is there anything, like we've been going at this for about 50 minutes here. Is there anything else that you wanted to kind of include in this first segment? We're going to be doing the first segment for the public, and the second segment will be for patrons. Is there anything else you kind of wanted to include in this first segment today, or should we move over?
Well, if we're gonna, I guess if this is the end for the public portion, if one of the things which I do, at least what I'm doing right now, is I help people decode or see their. I'll take one step back. My opinion is of how one of the things which this worldwide initiation is doing is, and in its way that it's serving us, is it is forcing whatever is inside to come to the surface. Like you can't, there's so much pressure, no matter how you want to look at it, that it's going to force that stuff up. That's just natural. And because this is such a significant event, and the reason why I'm saying it's so significant is like name another time in history where this large of a percentage of the population of people living on Earth are going through the exact same experience. Like there isn't a precedent for this. And so this is really, really, really unique. This is a collective experience, but it's immensely personal because, you're the one locked in your own closet. So that being said, the opportunity is to finally like come to terms and see your story perhaps in a different way for one purpose and one purpose only, so that you can transcend it. And so what I do is, and what I'm doing right now is I've changed one of my services where people give me an in-depth intake form. I ask them all these questions about their history, and then I look at their astrology, and then I'm like, what's coming up right now? And I identify, I'm like, these are the trends. This is what your astrology would suggest. And, based upon the stories you told me, like I'm seeing this, and this is what's coming up in your life. And so I call that the Starboard Light Service. And so we do like a 1-hour call on Zoom. And that is a way, if people are interested, what's often helpful is like to have that new perspective of seeing one's own story. That is something which I'm actively doing right now. And if that's of interest, you could go to susquehannaalchemy.com and you can find that. That's called the Starboard Light Service. And I got some other really cool stuff on there as well. I'm not doing any more, at least while I'm in the church, any of the traditional starboard ceremonies, which are very in-depth kind of honoring and telling of your astrological story. And then for other places, like I've been putting out what I think is a lot of really interesting content on my YouTube channel, and talking very much about, the playbook which is being used to, which is happening from the astrological perspective, and how this is a Saturnian expression of the age of Aquarius and what all that means, and like kind of like deciphering that. You can find that at YouTube on Susquehanna Alchemy is my channel, and then also at Instagram. Like there's a lot of good stuff there as well. So for anyone who wants to go deeper, that's where you can go.
Cool. All right. And working with Michael is a lot of fun, guys. So check it out. All right. And you guys can find, from here going forward, all of my media will be available both here on OffPlanet Media and on the Emily Moyer YouTube channel that will serve as sort of a backup channel. So make sure you just subscribe there. And if you would like to join us for the next segment, go to patreon.com/OffPlanet Media. And we're going to start setting out the sort of metaphysics and the physics for pocket universe or something like that on the other side. All right, we'll see you guys in just a minute.